You board a plane, cross an entire ocean in a few hours, and barely think about the water beneath you at all. Now, picture this instead. On the Indonesian island of Flores, stone tools have been found dated to around 800,000 years ago, left behind by a human relative that, as far as we know, had not yet invented the boat. To get there, that ancient hominin had to cross a deep water strait that never closed, not even during ice ages when sea levels dropped low enough to connect most of the rest of Southeast Asia by dry land. This particular gap stayed open. It's part of an invisible boundary now called Wallace's Line, and almost nothing without wings was supposed to be able to cross it. And yet, somehow, something did. The story of how isn't really about human cleverness at all. It's stranger than that. For most of Earth's history, oceans functioned as hard borders. Land animals evolved on one side of a strait and simply stayed there, sometimes for tens of millions of years. The turning point wasn't a tool or an invention. It was a mechanism biologists call rafting, the accidental transport of land animals across open water on floating mats of storm-torn vegetation. It sounds too fragile to matter, but rafting is now understood to explain how entire lineages of animals, and possibly our own ancestors, ended up on islands they had no deliberate way of reaching. The stakes of a single crossing were enormous. Get swept out on the wrong raft, and you're either colonize a new landmass, or you're one of the countless castaways whose bones and voyages left no trace at all. Homo erectus, one of our earliest ancestors to leave Africa, somehow reached Flores roughly 800,000 to a million years ago, based on stone tools found layered between volcanic deposits. Researchers studying this crossing point out that Homo erectus doesn't appear to have needed a deliberately built boat at all. The strait separating Flores from the nearest mainland could plausibly have been crossed on a natural raft of drifting trees and vegetation, torn loose by a storm. This wasn't a controlled journey. It was almost certainly involuntary, swept out to sea, carried by currents, and stranded on an unfamiliar shore with no way back. That single accident, if it happened, may have founded an entire isolated population, one that some researchers believe eventually evolved into Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit. But an accident happening once is easy to dismiss as coincidence. Could it really happen again to other species and actually work? In October 1995, two hurricanes tore through the Caribbean, and weeks later, fishermen on the island of Anguilla spotted something that shouldn't have been there. At least 15 green iguanas riding ashore on a raft of uprooted trees, over 30 feet long. Scientists later confirmed, in a study published in Nature, that the iguanas had drifted roughly 200 miles from the island of Guadalupe, likely spending weeks at sea on that same tangle of logs and branches. This wasn't a one-off curiosity. It was the first solid, observed proof that land vertebrates really can colonize islands purely by accident, using nothing but a storm and a floating mat of vegetation. The iguanas didn't choose to leave. They survived because they happened to be cold-blooded, needing far less food and water than a warm-blooded traveler would over weeks adrift. If a reptile could survive an accidental 200-mile ocean crossing in living memory, the deeper question becomes, how far back does this pattern go? Much further back than most people assume. Genetic evidence suggests the ancestors of Madagascar's lemurs rafted across the Mozambique Channel from mainland Africa somewhere between 50 and 60 million years ago. Even more strikingly, New World monkeys are believed to have crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean from Africa to South America by rafting tens of millions of years before any human would exist to attempt anything similar on purpose. These weren't short hops, they were journeys across open ocean that by any reasonable measure should have killed every passenger long before landfall. Instead, entire lineages of animals, and quite possibly our own ancestral line on Flores, owe their presence somewhere new to nothing more sophisticated than a hurricane and a fallen tree. The turning point. Everything changes around 60,000 to 65,000 years ago when modern humans reached Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that later became Australia and New Guinea. This crossing was different in kind, not just distance. Reaching Sahul required deliberately crossing open water stretches of at least 55 to 70 miles, wide enough that no storm-driven raft could plausibly explain it, and crucially, it required enough people arriving together to found a genetically viable population, not a single stranded survivor. That detail matters more than it first appears. A lone castaway can survive a crossing, but only an intentional, planned voyage carrying multiple people, deliberately, can actually found a lasting population on the other side. This is the moment sea crossings stopped being a biological accident and became a cultural act, the first evidence we have of humans building, or at least assembling, something capable of carrying a group across a horizon they could not see beyond. The word navigate itself, from the Latin for ship and to drive, didn't exist yet in any language, but the behavior it would eventually describe had just been born. That distinction, accident versus intention, still quietly shapes how you think about the world's oceans today. Modern transportation makes every crossing feel inevitable, engineered, and safe, which makes it easy to forget that most of life's early distribution across the planet, including possibly our own ancestors' arrival on certain islands, was never engineered at all. Biologists still refer to this as a founder effect, the idea that a small, accidental group of arrivals can shape the genetics of an entire population for millions of years afterward, still visible today in the DNA of isolated island species. We tend to picture our species spread across the globe as a triumph of planning. Some of it clearly was, but some of the very first steps may have simply been chance working in our favor over and over until enough of it added up to look like intention. So, what if the earliest chapters of human expansion weren't stories of discovery at all? What if they were stories of survival after an accident nobody chose? And if that's true, how much of what we now call human ingenuity was actually built on top of pure, undeserved luck? Picture that plane window again, the ocean scrolling by beneath you, utterly unremarkable. Somewhere below that water lies the same invisible line that once stopped nearly everything without wings, a boundary broken not by genius, but by a storm, a fallen tree, and an ancestor who never meant to leave home at all. We built boats and later planes so that crossing an ocean would never again depend on chance, and in doing so, we buried just how strange and fragile our arrival on the far side of that line really was. Somewhere in your own history, an ancestor's entire future came down to which way the current happened to be moving that day. If stories like this are the kind that stick with you, there's more of this hidden history waiting here.